Hey, welcome to Notebook Summaries. So today we're going to talk about a truly incredible survival story. We're looking at Liechtenstein, a country that's actually smaller than Washington, D.C. It's just tucked away in the Alps. But its history, well, it's a total masterclass in how to adapt and be politically savvy.
Right, so let's just get straight into it, because this is the big question, isn't it? I mean, think about it. Liechtenstein has been wedged between some of Europe's biggest, most aggressive empires for centuries. And yet, it's still here. Not just surviving, but thriving. So how on earth did they manage that? Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with how it went from just a land purchase to a real nation. Then we'll see how it survived Europe's great empires and its critical pivot to Switzerland. We'll also cover how it navigated the Nazi threat, which was a really close call. And finally, we'll look at how it became the modern financial powerhouse it is today. It's going to be quite a journey.
All right, first up, from land purchase to nation. People call it the accidental country, and for good reason. You see, its origin story isn't about some epic battle or an ancient tribe. Nope. It's a story about ambition and a really, really smart real estate deal.
So if you look at this timeline, the actual land that is Liechtenstein has been around for a long, long time. I mean, its borders were basically set way back in 1434. But the country of Liechtenstein, that's a much more recent invention. It only came into being when a super powerful Austrian noble family, the House of Liechtenstein, bought up these two little territories in 1699 and 1712. And they did it for one very specific, very strategic reason. So you might be asking, why would they buy this remote mountainous chunk of land? Well, it was all about getting a seat at the table, the big table. You see, the Liechtenstein family was fabulously wealthy, but none of the land they owned was held directly from the Holy Roman Emperor. And that was a problem. It meant they couldn't get into the imperial diet, which was basically the empire's VIP political club. This land purchase, it was their golden ticket. And this part is just wild. It really shows you how much of a pure political play this was. For more than 120 years, not a single ruling prince ever even visited the principality that was named after them. Can you imagine? They just ran things from their palaces in Austria. The country wasn't a home. It was just a tool, a piece on the chessboard to get more power. Okay, so now they have their country, but almost immediately Europe just explodes into chaos. So let's get into our second part, surviving Europe's great empires. How did this tiny new principality manage to navigate that storm? And then, boom, Napoleon happens. He just rolls through and completely redraws the map of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, the very institution they bought the land to get into, gone, dissolved in 1806. You'd think that would be the end for Liechtenstein, right? That it would just get swallowed up by a bigger neighbor? But no, in a crazy twist, Napoleon gives it a massive upgrade. He makes it a fully sovereign, independent state. That one move, right there, changed everything. Believe it or not, the country actually had a tiny army for a little while. And this leads to one of my all-time favorite historical stories. It's a bit of a legend, but here it goes. In 1866, during the Austro-Prussian War, they sent out their army, all 80 of them, to guard a mountain pass. They never saw any fighting, and when they marched back home, 81 men returned. Yep, 81. The story goes they made a friend along the way. Some say he was an Austrian officer, others say an Italian guy who just wanted to come along. It's just perfect. So just 2 years after that whole 81-man army incident, Liechtenstein makes this absolutely radical move. They realized that having an army was expensive, unpopular, and frankly, a bit pointless. So in 1868, they just disbanded it. And at the same time, they declared permanent neutrality. This wasn't a sign of weakness at all. It was a massive, conscious bet on a whole new identity. From now on, survival wasn't about fighting. It was about being smart and staying out of the way. But that whole neutrality strategy, it was about to face its biggest test yet. World War I comes along, and Liechtenstein's longtime protector, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, literally just vanishes off the map. This forces them into our next chapter, the critical pivot to Switzerland. They needed a new anchor, and they needed it fast. So even though they were neutral, World War I was an absolute disaster for Liechtenstein. Because they were so close to Austria-Hungary, they got slapped with this crippling economic embargo by the Allied powers. I mean, people were actually starving. So now their protector is gone, their economy is in ruins, they're completely adrift. They had no choice but to make a big change.
And so they began this very careful, very methodical pivot towards their other neighbor, Switzerland. It wasn't just one big decision, it was a series of really smart steps. In 1919, they basically said, "Hey, Switzerland, can you handle our foreign policy for us?" A year later, they ditched the worthless Austrian currency for the super stable Swiss franc. And then the big one. In 1924, they formed a customs union, tying their economies together. This alliance would, quite literally, become their lifeline. And they were going to need that lifeline more than they could ever imagine, because Europe was about to descend into darkness all over again. This brings us to their darkest hour, navigating the Nazi threat. This was, without a doubt, the single biggest threat to their existence, ever.
Just look at how fast everything happened. March 1938, Nazi Germany annexes Austria. Suddenly, tiny Liechtenstein is completely surrounded by the Third Reich. In that exact same month, a new prince, Franz Joseph II, comes to power. And in a really clever move to show unity, the country's two rival political parties put their differences aside and formed a coalition government. But the danger wasn't just from the outside. Just a year later, a group of local Nazis actually tried to overthrow the government to pave the way for a German invasion. That coup failed, thankfully. And a huge reason why was the people themselves. Look at this number, 2,492. That's how many citizens signed a petition declaring their loyalty to an independent Liechtenstein. Now, you have to remember, the entire country only had about 10,000 people back then. So this was a massive, incredibly brave statement of defiance right in the face of the Nazi threat. So they managed to stay neutral all through World War II. But one of their most principled, most courageous moments actually happened right after the war. They gave asylum to about 500 anti-communist Russian soldiers who had fought against the Soviets. Now, the Soviet Union demanded they be sent back, which would have meant certain death. And little Liechtenstein stood up to the Soviets and said no. They argued the men weren't war criminals and protected them. I mean, talk about a principled stand against a superpower. So they survived the war, but now they faced a totally different kind of battle, complete economic collapse. And that brings us to our final section, how Liechtenstein became a modern financial powerhouse. This is the story of their final, most remarkable reinvention. The years after the war, they were bleak. The country was flat broke. It got so bad that the princely family, who owned one of the world's greatest private art collections, had to start selling off treasures. They even sold a Leonardo da Vinci painting just to keep the lights on. It was clear something dramatic had to change. And here's the genius move that turned everything around. They created a whole new economic model based on one simple idea: really, really low corporate taxes. And just like that, this simple but brilliant policy turned the country into a magnet for foreign companies and capital. It was the engine that drove their transformation from a poor farming country into one of the most prosperous financial centers on the planet.
And with all this new wealth came a new confidence. Liechtenstein was ready to properly join the world stage. So throughout the second half of the 20th century, you see them ticking off the boxes, joining all the important international clubs: the Council of Europe in '78, the UN in 1990, the European Economic Area in '95, all the way up to the IMF in 2024. And they modernized at home too, finally giving women the right to vote in 1984.
So, after all that, what do we take away from Liechtenstein's story? I think it's just this incredible lesson in pragmatic adaptation. It proves that to survive, you don't always have to be the biggest or the strongest. Sometimes it's about being the cleverest, the most willing to change, and knowing when it's time to make a completely radical bet on who you are. It really makes you think, in a world full of giants, what can we all learn from the clever survivor?
Hey, if you enjoyed this little trip through history, we've got a whole Quick Country Histories playlist you should definitely check out. And of course, please subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you won't miss what we dive into next. Thanks so much for watching.